Hello and welcome back to HY in 5, where in this short video I'm going to be talking to you a little bit about consent and also sharing with you my 5 top tips for making sure that your consent forms comply with the GDPR. Now, for most of you that work in a school setting, you're going to be aware that you're constantly processing personal information. On an almost daily basis, you're going to be processing information about students, staff, about parents, governors, and anybody else that comes into contact with the school. But in most circumstances, you're not going to need consent for that. And that's because there are other legal reasons which allow us to use personal information. And we deal with that in an earlier video. But there remain some situations where consent will be necessary. And a really good example of where it may be necessary is in relation to photographs and videos. Now, I say may be necessary because it's going to really depend on the purpose for which you want to use the photograph or video. If you want to use it for an educational purpose, then it's very much going to be the case that consent isn't going to be required. Conversely, if you want to use it for a non-educational purpose, then consent is going to be required. So it becomes important to try and be able to distinguish between the two. And what I'm going to do is give you a couple of examples which show how this works. So if we look at educational purposes, first of all. Now let's suppose for one moment that you're a secondary school and that you offer a GCSE qualification in dance. As part of the course requirement, each student is required to submit a video which contains their dance performance, and that will form the basis of their submission for a grade to be awarded. Now, in those circumstances, it's self-evident that the purpose of the video was for educational purposes, and therefore consent is not going to be required. If we take a second example then. So for most schools, they like to use photographs and videos for the purpose of celebrating educational achievement or to promote the school itself. And this is often done in a number of ways. You might choose to post a photograph of a child on social media, on a display in a school, share it with a newspaper, or put it in a prospectus. Because all of these reasons go beyond educational purposes and they fall into a non-educational purpose, then consent is always going to be required. Top 5 tips then. Tip number 1, keep your consent forms granular. So what we mean by this is for each type of use that you want to make of photographs and videos, we need to have separate consents in place. So in this example, we obtain separate consents for use on the website, social media, newspapers, and displays. And what that does is allow data subjects to retain a greater control over how you're using their personal information. One of the other important aspects of this is in relation to safeguarding. So let's imagine for one moment that we've got a child in the school, parents are separated, and there is a court order in place which prevents father from having any contact with either of them or even knowing which school that child attends. When mother receives this consent form, what she might indicate is no consent in relation to website, social media and newspapers, because that could alert father to where they live or which school the child attends, but may indicate yes in relation to displays, because that may only be for internal use and therefore not creating a safeguarding risk. Tip number 2 is that you can't use pre-tick boxes. Pre-tick boxes are a big no-no under the GDPR. So when you send your forms out, the parent or the carer has got to give positive opt-in consent. Tip number 3, you can never obtain consent by silence. So if you send a form out to a parent or carer which says something to the effect of, if we don't hear back from you, then we'll infer that you've consented, then that will not be valid consent. Positive opt-in will always be required. Tip number 4, this is in relation to withdrawing consent. Parents, carers can withdraw their consent at any time. So it's good practice within the consent form to explain that that right exists and exactly how they can do it. Tip number 5 is in relation to record keeping. It's really, really important to keep an accurate record of what consents are in place for which child. Just as importantly, staff need to be aware that if they're thinking about undertaking any of these actions, that they're checking what consents are in place for each particular child, because in worst case scenario, if they don't, it could potentially put a child at risk of harm.